that non-Mexicano Latino identities are rendered quasi-coherent, or at worst, a burgeoning threat in need of containment to many non-Latinos. In short, at this political moment, being Latino frequently means being Mexican, and we must be attentive to what this reveals about the U.S. national imaginary and the role of U.S. Latinos and Latin Americans within it. Consider, for example, the very recent case of Joseph Maturo, the taco-loving mayor of East Haven, Connecticut. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that case. I can talk about it later. Or, as illustrated by Isabel Molina Guzman, the mainstream national media coverage of the Elian Gonzalez case and its underlying narrative regarding the storied Cuban golden exiles of South Florida. Moreover, Los Tigres del Norte and their musical project offer a commentary on the multifaceted, at times conflicting ways in which the specific, in this case Mexican national and transnational identities, and the general, Latinidad writ large, interact within Latino-centered and Spanish-language media structures in a manner that highlights the ongoing saliency of both frameworks of identification, regardless of their underlying problematics. Both within and beyond major urban Latino centers, local ethno-racial identities continue to enjoy great political, economic, and symbolic significance, just as the nation-state has not lost its everyday primacy. The latter phrase perhaps rings most true for those individuals who must cross geopolitical borders on a regular basis, above all the undocumented. And here's where I part ways with the manner in which many cultural studies scholars frame the transnational. I do not believe that we are presently experiencing a strictly post-national moment. Nor do I describe to the notion that transnational dynamics necessarily constitute consciously resistant or celebratory processes, as some have asserted. To the contrary, despite the lesser importance ascribed to the traditional nation-state in this formulation, its ongoing role in the lives of transnational individuals is not to be underestimated. In this respect, I adhere to Luis Eduardo Guarnizo's position that transmigrants do not generally seek alternatives to traditional nation-state structures, but rather pursue what they consider a more advantageous multiple or dual citizen status within existing governmental structures. This vision translates into a theorization of popular culture rooted in the persistent tensions between containment and resistance, and mindful of the fact that transmigrant identities forged from below, while not intrinsically oppositional, are in fact quite distinct from those constructed from above. Per this perspective, transnational popular music and media serve as particularly rich sites for an analysis of the symbolic as well as the material impacts of the global cultural industries. In phrases that above all do not merely recognize but also contest Latin America's long-standing commodification by the North, René Pérez of Calle 13 invokes the ongoing pulse of migration that consistently challenges our notion of what it means to be quote-unquote American. As he says, soy la pesadilla del sueño americano. This is the sole aperture at which we might argue that Pérez explicitly frames the Latino, the Latin American, and the American in hemispheric terms, as he spins a stock phrase from the grand narrative of U.S. immigration. Why then do Latin American immigrants, their offspring, and those Latinos with century-long ties to the U.S. Southwest constitute a nightmare for the American dream? Outside of the academy, the answers are obvious. By and large, the Latino American experience of educational, housing, linguistic, and labor market segregation gives the lie to our cherished belief in this nation's colorblind meritocracy. Within the academy, the responses have garnered far less attention. In this respect, I would assert that if part of the American dream implies that we all have access to an education as a fundamental path towards individual success, and notice I did not say collective success because the American dream does not operate on those terms, then the mere presence and participation of Latinos in higher education refutes the common sense logic of what and whom U.S. higher education was intended for in the first place. Not only are we bodies occupying spaces and positions that were never designed with us in mind, many of us are also simultaneously challenging disciplinary boundaries, institutional structures, and hierarchies of knowledge. To this we owe our nightmare status. It is a location firmly rooted in the legacy of Americanity. While I find Quijano and Wallerstein's theoretical framework immensely useful, today one of my goals is to render their contributions even more concrete by inserting them into a broader dialogue on research and pedagogical practices. As Jose David Saldívar so eloquently asks, How can we begin mapping out a space that situates the Americas in our age of globalization as a cohesive but complexly differentiated space? To Saldívar's query, I would append the following questions. How might we also embrace Americanity as a theoretical looking glass across Iberian studies, Latino studies, American and Latin American studies, given the divergent, if at times overlapping, historical and political trajectories of these fields? What does it mean to adopt a hemispheric transatlantic approach when we are already conducting research from the periphery? And in the case of popular culture and Latino American studies, from the periphery of the periphery. In addition to a profound integration of the underlying precepts of Americanity as realities of our global era per Saldívar, I would assert that we must foremost strive to re-envision, if not to a large extent undo, the interdisciplinary and monodisciplinary geographies to which we are often so, and maybe too closely wed as scholars, as well as the linguistic hierarchies that govern our research and pedagogical strategies. This can mean rethinking, as Ginetta Candelario fruitfully suggests, that, for example, we approach the study of a nation such as the Dominican Republic not in terms of its geospatial borders, but in terms of a triangle, the historic, political, economic, and cultural triangle that unites the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and the United States. In a similar vein, I would argue that those of us in the fields of Latin American, Latino, Iberian, and American studies should be thinking not only in terms of discrete national identities and political, cultural, and social currents within the confines of the traditional nation state, but also at the level of interconnected economic, cultural, political, and historical systems, specifically those of Latin America, the Caribbean, Spain, Africa, the United States, and Canada. Moreover, these approaches cannot be limited to English, French, Spanish, or Portuguese-only practices. This revised linguistic approach must also include a rejection of the notion that Spanish in particular is a quote-unquote foreign language, as the United States is now the fourth largest Spanish-speaking nation in the world. And if we want to get technical, Spanish was spoken here before English. So, linguistic hierarchies very much aside, however, Spanish in the United States is undeniably a domestic transnational code, and our work needs to consistently reflect this reality on the ground. We may not hold all nations, regions, or continents at the center of our analyses, and will almost certainly never attain an equal level of expertise in each area, but this does not mean that a move in this direction does not constitute sound intellectual ground. Transnational interdisciplinary research can be done with breadth and depth. We can meaningfully incorporate content and methodological approaches from other fields and disciplines into our scholarship and courses. These are certainly challenging tasks, but they can be realized. I would insist that central to achieving these goals is the sincere willingness to first educate ourselves regarding the basic historical development and overarching intellectual concerns of those adjacent fields outside our own. We must also engage in a sustained commitment to pedagogical and research projects, both large and small, conducted across disciplinary and field-based boundaries. For someone in Latin American studies, this can be as simple as exchanging essay drafts with a colleague in Iberian studies, as an Iberian studies colleague could just as easily request permission to sit in on a course offered by a Latino studies specialist. Another more complex example might include the development of a transatlantic, transnational, and interdisciplinary team talk course on immigration between scholars in Iberian, Latin American, and Latino studies. These are but a few potential scenarios, and I'd be happy to discuss this set of issues in greater detail during the question and answer session, because I do want to be concrete today. It is apparently a well-kept secret within the academy that since the emergence of Chicano and Puerto Rican studies in the late 1960s to the development of Latino studies as an institutionalized field in the last few decades, Latino studies scholars have been engaged in intellectual products that are inherently transnational by definition, and that more often than not are rigorously interdisciplinary, collaborative, and community-based. Yes, we still undoubtedly occupy a peripheral position within the academy, as well as relative to Latin American, Iberian, and American studies. This peripheral position, as I stated earlier, is part and parcel of the legacy of Americanity. Nevertheless, the long-limbed historical reach of coloniality has not impeded many Latino studies scholars from employing the core building blocks of Americanity themselves as highly productive investigative and pedagogical frameworks, in essence dismantling the master's house with the tools of the master. This is the paradoxical location of the Latino within the academy. on the margins, yet simultaneously serving as a critical point of reference within the ongoing worlding of Latin American, Iberian, and American studies. Per this example, I would strongly encourage you to consider, or to reconsider as the case may be, whether or not you are doing your own most pressing research questions and pedagogical practices justice by remaining resolutely tied to one methodology, discipline, or field, much less one set of national borders. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions or address any comments or be more concrete if need be.
Well, first of all, it was a really, really great paper.
Thank you.
I was thinking about Albert Brass, this guy from Canada who was doing some reviews to books like Les Amériques du Monde, Les Mondes Amériques, about the Americanness of the studies. He posted the question about, okay, should we talk about American studies and encompass the whole continent, or probably talk about the Americas? That's one question. And the other is like getting more concrete about these propositions you gave about how to deal with multidisciplinary issues. What should be done within the institutional restructuring of academic programs in order that we could do something like that? For example, in cultural studies, there was this discussion about, okay, should we do an MA program, a PhD program, or rather have our disciplines, each one in their size, plus a minor in cultural studies, or something that could help? What are the options you?
Okay, I'll just answer your first question. I have a real, this is from the perspective of somebody who got a PhD in Spanish without taking a single class in a Spanish department. I worked through, I did my graduate certificate in Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the same time as I was working through an American Studies department doing transnational Latino Latin American Studies work. So I'm very familiar with what it's like to navigate institutions in certain ways because at the time I was doing my doctoral work, and I think I would say it still holds true today, those structures that needed to be in place to do certain kinds of work weren't in place, right? I have a whole problem with even the name American Studies. I think it's outdated. It's indicative of a mindset that hopefully we're getting past, but I think we're still very entrenched in. That's what I can say about American Studies. I do agree we need to be talking about the Americas with an S at the end of it, always, always. And I don't think there's any way we can get around that anymore. As far as how institutions can be reconfigured, the suggestion of doing a minor in cultural studies and then having people stay in their disciplines, my first reaction is I find that slightly problematic because part of having power within an educational institution is having your own space, your own faculty members that are specifically dedicated to that particular discipline or interdiscipline. And when you're relegated to being a minor, that says something about the status of that field within that institution. So I can really speak also to the tendency within institutions in the United States, at the very least, in the last several years, to collapse Latino and Latin American studies together. I can understand doing that in certain very careful ways because it makes theoretical sense, but I think too often it gets done for economic reasons. And because there's an idea about, let's share administrative staff, let's share space. So I think that's how it often gets done, unfortunately. Latino studies and Latin American studies and American studies have very different political and historical trajectories, and I think those need to be respected and understood. That doesn't mean that I don't think you can do both of them or all three of them at the same time, however. I just think one of the problems we have is that people who do American studies, Latin American studies, Latino studies are more often than not educated about even the most minor details as to how the other fields came about, right? And some of the tendencies within them and some of their primary questions. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but I'm very skeptical about collapsing
Right.
programs and fields of inquiry into each other. In an ideal world, they wouldn't have to be that way, but there would definitely be institutionalized links between them, and that students would be encouraged to cross those bridges. I keep on hearing, in the last day, I've been here for, 24 hours, not even 24 hours, and I keep on hearing some of the same concerns from graduate students that I had when I was a graduate student. The idea that, wow, do I go and get a PhD in an interdiscipline, or do I get a PhD in a discipline? How am I going to get a job later on? Nobody's going to want to hire me if I get a job, if I have a doctoral degree in an interdiscipline. And that's exactly what I was told, less than 10 years ago when I got my PhD. It was the same thing. That's why I stayed in a Spanish department, because I thought it would, I was told that was going to be easier for me getting a job.
And
Yeah.
most of the time, even the programs like push students towards
Yes,
specific topics,
disciplines.
right?
Yes, they do. But then you see formulations. I'm thinking particularly of the University of Michigan's American Culture program, which has students that do work in Latino and Latin American studies at the same time. But they have what are called disciplinary spines. You do interdisciplinary work, but you might have more of a specialization within a specific discipline, and you'll take courses in that. But those won't be all of your courses. So for me, not to over-idealize that configuration, but I think that is a step in the right direction, as I see it.
I mean, don't you think that in the past 10, 15 years, and I'm comparing to the time when you were at the University of Michigan, what happened with the cultural studies parent?
Oh,
So
yes.
that the Spanish department, with Spanish and Portuguese in our case, is no longer a bastion of canonized literary forms, but it's much more than that. And on Monday we are going to have a dissertation defense on someone who did it on Cartonera publishers.
Yeah.
You can't get further from academia than that.
Yeah, from canon.
So, or far away from canon. So I think lots of things are changing within the structure of the literary studies.
I think so too. It's been a slow change. I was the very first person to come out of the University of Michigan with a master's thesis or a PhD in the Spanish department that were not on one of the four fields. One of the four fields: Latin American literature, Latin American contemporary literature, peninsular contemporary. The fields that they generally tend to do. I was the only person the first person to do that who didn't do literary studies, and that was a fight. That was a fight, and that wasn't very long ago. The changes are coming, but I still think some people are, coming to those changes kicking and screaming, But then again, I don't know if it's realistic institutionally to expect everybody to jump on the cultural studies bandwagon or the interdisciplinarity bandwagon because of their own training and, and the generation in which, they were intellectually formed, so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So thinking about the terms in which we approach and engage with the topics that we're writing about or speaking about as scholars, one of the things that has come up amongst students and faculty in anthropology a lot, at least in our department lately, informal conversations and otherwise, is the idea of positioned observerhood, the idea that each of us brings something else, something different to the table based on who we are, where we come from, how we're looking at things, and that there's some value, maybe a great deal of value, in writing from that position and creating knowledge from that position in terms of, or I guess, letting people know how we do that.
Absolutely.
So how do you see that kind of thing fitting in as a strategy or not fitting in as a strategy for once we're just kind of doing our work, beyond the getting a degree and other things, just kind of doing it?
I think it's a wonderful question. I think it's an argument for self-reflexivity. I think that's what, as I understand what you're saying, you're making an argument for self-reflexivity. And I am very much in favor of that, right? Understanding your own subject position, not only as a scholar producing knowledge, but also as somebody standing in front of a classroom, right? I think that's critically important. I think within anthropology, there's definitely been a turn towards that, and some people have taken it almost to an extreme, which I'm not personally entirely comfortable with, but I think that measured self-reflexivity is critical. It's central. Yeah,
Do you
definitely.
see that as a challenge or a tool to work against the marginal positions that people are put into, or
Yeah, I
maybe
see.
as more
Yeah.
marginalizing possibly?
I don't see it as more marginalizing. I see it as being honest about power. Right, people's positions, their positions of power or lack thereof, within the academy, outside of the academy, in the field, as you may. So, I don't see it necessarily as having a marginalizing effect. I think it can be very empowering. In fact, when people are honest and critical about who they are and what they're bringing to the table and how that impacts the production, their scholarly production, right, and their pedagogical practices. Then again, sometimes I think people take it too far, but I, when done critically, I think it's extremely useful and necessary, absolutely necessary. Yeah. I remember, people saying to me when I was in graduate school, oh, well, because I was always writing about U.S. Latinos, and I'm a U.S. Latina, saying, well, you have a personal investment in this, and I don't. And I remember thinking, you've spent 7 years of your life here, and you don't have a personal investment in what you're writing about? Just because you're not Latin American, Spanish, or a U.S. Latino? That struck me as flawed logic. So, I think that we all have these investments, and it's important to be honest about them and to relativize, our positions, to the kind of work we're doing. So.
Yeah, it called my attention your idea of transnational force of immigration from Latin America and Iberian and Latino perspective. Is that something that you're doing in Williams College, or
That's not something that's,
exploring, or?
it's a side fascination of mine. I spent a lot of time in Spain as somebody who studied there before the wave, the large, I don't know if I want to use the word wave because, well, I have problems with that word, but before the large, these very significant amounts of Latin American transmigrants began arriving. I was saying last night in dinner, I go there in 1993 to study, and I show up 10 years again because I had such a horrible experience in Spain that I stayed out of there for 10 years. And because I found it a profoundly racist, very sort of insular society in 1993. I go back 10 years later, and it was in many ways a very different country. And what I'm curious to see, I'm curious to see, and I keep on looking for this in newspaper accounts, I'm curious to see what the Latin Americans in Spain are going to start calling themselves, because they sure aren't calling themselves Spaniards. And I wonder if it's going to be in any way parallel to or share any characteristics with what has happened among Latino immigrants and transmigrants in the United States, and how this is all going to impact just the way in which Spaniards understand who they are. So that's something I'm interested in seeing, what's happening. Nothing has been written to my knowledge about that yet. So.
To move from the transnational, though this might actually get back to that, to the kind of very local, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the most recent thing I've read about Los Tigres is that the Sinaloan government has banned them from playing in Sinaloa because some of their corridos.
The narco-corridos.
Narco-corridos.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Glorify the trade in narcotics.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering if, we can read anything into this on America as a sort of, I don't know, as a reaction to being banned from their home state, from performing their home state, or how they renegotiate their identity, hemispherically.
Yeah, no, perhaps so you could read it that way. The song predates the narco-corridos.
Okay.
Well, actually, no. Contrabando y Traición is their first big hit, and that is definitely about one of the big industry on the border, contraband.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you could make that argument that America's a reaction to being banned.
Sure.
But Los Tigres del Norte are well known for the narco-corridos,
Yeah.
and I'm not surprised that they were banned. But in a sense, I don't think it's going to affect their audience.
Yeah.
in terms of sales or fan base or anything. If anything, it might have the opposite effect,
Yeah.
right? I think it's a symbolic gesture more than anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of U.S. imperialism in the common imaginary that's produced in the song. I mean, René specifically specifies la Operación Condor,
Yeah.
Cold War, police network, right?
Absolutely.
Throughout Latin America, during eras of dictatorships and things of that nature. And of course, Puerto Rico's status as the longest colony in the Western Hemisphere,
Yeah.
right? And then the many parallels between Puerto Rican and Mexican communities in the United States, in
Mhm.
spaces like Chicago, for example.
Mhm.
So I guess it's a two-part question, the notion of U.S. imperialism as in the song, and then how would this concept of Americanness look, not just in the Southwest, but something like the Midwest
Yeah.
or the Middle Atlantic, where the demographics may be different.
You're absolutely right. The concept is going to look very different. But to answer the first question, I think that the song, I'm reading the song as sort of a reminder. It's seen as a very brief history, a reminder of, okay, this is what the United States has done in the Americas. It's a reminder there are gaps. I think one of, and like I said, the most glaring gap is the fact that all of those imperial gestures are undertaken outside the borders of the United States, and the fact that so many of those imperial gestures have resulted in the movement of so many people to the United States is overlooked, right? So that for me is one of the major gaps here. I think this is a very overtly oppositional song. And that's what I think I could say to the first